Bob Marley laughed at Jimi Hendrix in a Jamaica recording studio, and Jimmy's response silenced the entire band. It was March 1968, and Kingston, Jamaica was in the middle of a musical revolution that most of the world hadn't noticed yet. In the cramped but legendary Studio One on Brentford Road, the rhythms that would eventually reshape popular music across the entire planet were being created by a tight community of musicians who understood something profound about the relationship between rhythm and the human spirit. Bob Marley was 23 years old and already at the center of that community, a young man with a musical intelligence that moved through rhythmic patterns the way water moves through stone, finding the precise channels that made people feel things they couldn't articulate. Studio One itself was more than a recording facility. It was the beating heart of Jamaican popular music, the place where ska had evolved into rocksteady and where rocksteady was now transforming into something newer and deeper and more urgent, the music that would eventually be called reggae. The studio's owner, Clement Dodd, had an ear that could identify the quality of a performance in the first 4 bars, and the musicians who worked there regularly were the best Jamaica had produced. The studio smelled of cigarette smoke and the particular electrical scent of overworked amplifiers, and its walls had absorbed so much music over the years that some musicians swore you could hear the ghosts of old sessions in the reverb. Jimi Hendrix had come to Kingston on the advice of a musician friend who told him that if he wanted to understand rhythm at its deepest level, he needed to spend time in Jamaica. Jimi had listened. He had arrived in March with his guitar and no particular agenda, more curious than anything else, following the instinct that had always guided him toward musical experiences that could teach him something he didn't already know. He had spent his first 2 days in Kingston just walking and listening, visiting the sound system dances that were the primary venue for popular music on the island, sitting in yards where people gathered in the evenings to play. What he heard was simultaneously familiar and entirely new, music that shared DNA with the American blues and R&B that had shaped his own development, but had grown in a completely different direction, shaped by a different climate and a different history and a different understanding of what music was supposed to do. He had been brought to Studio One by a mutual contact who knew both artists and thought the meeting might produce something interesting. What nobody had anticipated was how the afternoon would begin. Bob Marley was in the middle of a session when Jimi arrived, working through the rhythmic architecture of a new track with his core musicians. The Wailers at that point were a tight, self-contained musical unit who had developed their own internal language, a set of rhythmic understandings so precise and so specific to Jamaican musical tradition that outsiders rarely grasped what they were hearing on first exposure. When the session paused and Marley was introduced to Jimi, his response was cordial but measured. He knew who Jimi Hendrix was. The records had reached Jamaica. But Marley carried a musician's skepticism toward music that operated in a different tradition, particularly music built around the electric guitar's capacity for distortion and volume, rather than around the syncopated heartbeat of Caribbean rhythm. "I've heard your music," Marley said, settling into a chair and regarding Jimi with the comfortable authority of someone on his own ground. "It's impressive what you do with the guitar. Very technical, very loud." He paused, and the pause had weight. "But electric guitar has no conversation with rhythm the way we understand rhythm. Rock music pushes forward. Reggae pulls back. They speak different languages." The musicians in the room, bassist Robbie Shakespeare, drummer Sly Dunbar, keyboardist Tyrone Downey, exchanged glances. This was familiar territory for Marley, the assertion of reggae's rhythmic primacy, and they had heard him make the case before. They believed it because they had lived it. The offbeat emphasis of ska and rocksteady and the emerging reggae sound created a relationship with rhythm that seemed to them fundamentally incompatible with the forward-driving energy of rock music. "You think so?" Jimi said, quietly. "I know so," Marley replied, and then he laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, not the laugh of someone trying to diminish another artist. It was the laugh of a man who was comfortable enough in his musical identity to find the notion of an electric guitar conversing with reggae rhythm slightly absurd. "That guitar of yours," he nodded toward the Stratocaster in Jimmy's hands, "it doesn't know how to find the space between the beats. That's where reggae lives, in the space." The musicians laughed with him, not unkindly, but with the recognition of people who understood exactly what he meant. The space between the beats, the rest, the deliberate absence of sound that created reggae's characteristic hypnotic pull. It was a musical concept that required a specific kind of listening and a specific kind of restraint that seemed to everyone in that room to be the opposite of everything Jimmy's guitar represented. What happened next, nobody in Studio One that afternoon ever forgot. Jimmy didn't respond with words. He didn't argue the point or defend his approach to music. He simply adjusted the settings on the small practice amplifier that had been set up in the corner of the studio, brought the volume down to something close to conversational, and began to play. He didn't play anyone recognized. He didn't reach for the familiar architecture of his own catalog. He didn't play Purple Haze or Hey Joe or any of the recordings that had made him famous. He played a rhythm. Specifically, he played the rhythm he had been listening to all morning while sitting in the back of the studio observing Marley's session. He had been sitting quietly for 2 hours before Marley arrived, listening to the musicians work through their patterns, and he had been doing what he always did when he listened to music he wanted to understand, absorbing it at a level below conscious thought, letting his hands find what his ears were learning. The rhythm that came out of his Stratocaster was reggae, not an approximation of reggae, not a rock musician's interpretation of reggae. Reggae the way the musicians in that studio played it, with the emphasis landing in exactly the spaces that Marley had just described. The guitar finding the gap between the beats and living there, patient and unhurried. The distortion turned almost completely off so that what came through was something warm and precise and deeply felt. Robbie Shakespeare stopped tuning his bass. Sly Dunbar set down his drumsticks. Tyrone Downey lifted his hands from the keyboard. The entire band went still in the way musicians go still when they hear something that requires their complete attention. They were not looking at each other. They were all looking at Jimmy's hands moving on the fretboard of his Stratocaster, producing a rhythm that by every right shouldn't have been possible from that instrument played by that man. Bob Marley said nothing. He sat forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, and listened with an expression that moved through several stages in the space of a few minutes. The amusement was gone first, then the comfortable certainty. What replaced them was something harder to name, the look of a person who was hearing something that challenged a belief they had considered settled. Jimmy played for 4 minutes without stopping. He didn't embellish the rhythm with the pyrotechnics that made him famous. He didn't build to a climax or demonstrate his technical range. He simply found the pocket of reggae rhythm and stayed there, the electric guitar doing something it had never publicly done before, speaking the musical language of Jamaica with an accent so close to native that the native speakers in the room couldn't quite believe what they were hearing. When he stopped, the studio was completely silent. "Where did you learn that?" Marley asked finally. His voice was different from before. The comfortable authority was still there, but something had been added to it, something that sounded like genuine curiosity, the tone of a musician who had encountered something that expanded his understanding of what was possible. "I've been sitting back there since this morning," Jimmy said simply, nodding toward the corner where he had spent the earlier part of the day, listening. Marley looked at him for a long moment. "You learned that in 1 morning?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "You play something long enough and the guitar starts to understand it before you do." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room full of musicians processing a new idea. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who need a moment before they can say anything worthy of the occasion.
Robbie Shakespeare picked up his bass. He began playing the rhythm he had been working on before the session paused, the pattern that anchored the track they had been developing all morning. And then something happened that had never happened in that studio before. Jimi Hendrix began playing with him, not over him, with him, finding the complementary space in the rhythm, the electric guitar and the bass, creating a conversation that should have been impossible between those two instruments in those two traditions, and was instead so natural that after 30 seconds it was difficult to remember it hadn't always existed. Sly Dunbar came in on drums, Tyrone Downey added keys, and for the next 20 minutes, Bob Marley's band played reggae with Jimi Hendrix as if they had been rehearsing together for months. Marley stood at the edge of the room and watched with his arms crossed and an expression that nobody there had seen on his face before. Not speechless exactly, more like the silence of someone who has had something confirmed that they had suspected but hadn't let themselves fully believe.
After the session wound down, Marley approached Jimi. "I said electric guitar doesn't know how to find the space," he said. "I was wrong about you specifically." It was the kind of acknowledgement that meant more coming from Bob Marley than a longer speech would have from anyone else. Marley was not a man who revised his musical opinions lightly. His entire artistic identity was built on the certainty of his own musical understanding, the absolute conviction that reggae rhythm represented something true and irreducible about human experience. The concession that Jimi had demonstrated something he hadn't accounted for was, in the language of that community and that tradition, an enormous thing to say. "The space between the beats," Jimi said. "That's where I've always been trying to live. I just didn't have a name for it until today." Marley looked at him for a moment, then laughed. A different laugh from the one earlier in the afternoon. This one wasn't dismissive or certain or comfortable. This one was the laugh of a person who has been surprised by music in exactly the way they hoped to be surprised. The laugh of an artist who has just learned something they didn't know they needed to know. The musicians who were present that afternoon in Kingston carried the memory of those 20 minutes with them for the rest of their careers. Robbie Shakespeare said in later interviews that playing with Jimi that day changed how he thought about what the bass was doing in reggae music, that it made him hear the instrument's relationship to rhythm differently, with greater awareness of the spaces that Jimi had found and inhabited so naturally. Sly Dunbar said he heard the rhythm differently afterward, too. He had always understood intellectually that the rest, the silence between the beats, was where reggae's power lived. Watching Jimi find that silence on an instrument everyone assumed could only fill it taught him something about the nature of musical restraint that he hadn't been able to articulate before, but that changed how he approached the drum kit from that point forward. Tyrone Downey, the keyboardist, was perhaps the most affected of the three. He had been the most skeptical when Jimi began to play, certain that what was coming would be an approximation, a tourist's version of a rhythm that took years to fully inhabit. What he got instead was something that made him put his hands in his lap and simply listen, the way you listen when someone is teaching you something you thought you already knew. For Jimi, the afternoon in Kingston crystallized something he had been circling for years without being able to name it, the space between the beats. He had been living there instinctively in his best work, in the pauses between phrases on Little Wing, in the breathing room he gave a melody before delivering its resolution. Jamaica gave him a language for what his hands had always known. He spent 4 more days in Kingston after the Studio One session, visiting musicians and listening to sound systems and sitting with the rhythms until they were as familiar as his own heartbeat.
When he left, he took the rhythmic understanding he had developed in those days back into his own music, and those who listened closely to the work he produced in the months afterwards could hear it in the spaces he left open, the silences that had learned from reggae rhythm how to be eloquent. And Bob Marley, who would go on to become the most celebrated musical figure to emerge from the Caribbean, said once, in a brief aside during an interview years later, that he had learned something in Kingston that March afternoon about not deciding in advance what a musician could understand. The electric guitar and reggae rhythm had spoken the same language, and it had taken Jimi Hendrix one morning of sitting quietly in the corner and listening to prove it. If this story of musical respect crossing cultural boundaries inspired you, please subscribe and hit the like button. Share this with someone who loves music and understands that the greatest musicians have always learned from each other. Have you ever witnessed someone master something in a way that seemed impossible? Tell us in the comments, and ring the notification bell for more stories about the moments when music breaks down every wall that human beings build between themselves.